everyone, and a very warm welcome. I'm going to start talking while you're entering the room. My name is Jennifer Nadel, and I'm the chair of the Global Compassion Coalition. And it's a delight to be joined by you for our event on a caring economy. Is it something that we're just imagining would be possible, or is it something that we can actually achieve? What would compassionate economics look like? How can we rewire our economy for care, equity, and justice? Just to lay out the background to this discussion, our economy isn't working for most of us, nor for the planet, nor the species that we co-inhabit it with. We have gross inequalities. While the rich get richer, millions continue to starve or die from causes that are easily preventable. The 100 wealthiest people on our planet have the capacity to end poverty 4 times over. It's not that we don't have solutions. We don't have an economy that delivers for all. Before we get down to the economics of it, I just wanted to say a word about compassion, because compassion can sound out of context in the economic space, but it actually belongs right at the heart of the economic space. And to give you the definition that we work with, which comes from Paul Gilbert, who runs the Compassionate Mind Foundation, it is that compassion is an empathetic concern with the suffering of another, coupled with action. So compassion is about equality. It's about standing shoulder to shoulder with others and acting to ensure true equality. It's not kindness, it's not a feeling state, it's an action state. And if we want a fairer society, then we need a more compassionate economy. And that's what we're here to discuss with an incredible panel for whom I'm very grateful that they've joined us. We have Katy Chakrabortty, Head of Policy and Advocacy at Oxfam. We have Lene Rachel Andersen, President of Nordic, Bildung and co-founder of Global Bildung Network. We have Stewart Wallis, Executive Chair of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and Elham Fakhro, Research Fellow, Exeter University Centre for Gulf Studies, and an Associate Fellow of Chatham House Middle East and North African Programme. Welcome all. And the format of the event is that I'm going to give each speaker a couple of minutes to up to 5 minutes to lay out their stall, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and there will be space for you to come in and ask questions of the panelist. If you want to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And do feel free to tell us where you're joining us from. This is a global coalition, and we always like to have an awareness of where people are from. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Katy Chakrabortty from Oxfam. Over to you, Katy.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Thanks everyone for being here. So Oxfam, Oxfam celebrated its 80th birthday last year. So in some ways that is 80 years of an organisation that is trying to build and use that muscle of compassion that you were talking about, Jennifer, encouraging people to use that compassion for people that they don't know, often on the other side of the world as well, through donating, campaigning, fundraising and volunteering. And that founding happened in a time of war. It happened and was used to raise awareness of the plight of people in Greece behind an Allied blockade. And there had to be that political challenge to get that message and that aid of compassion through, even in wartime. And the whole development movement that you might talk about has really taken root after the Second World War. And it has helped to save millions of lives, responding to humanitarian crises, tackling disease, getting girls into school, improving millions of livelihoods. But as we look around at the sort of impact of the world today, and particularly where we're left after the current, what's now called polycrisis of climate change, pandemic, food crises, It's just shown how paper thin and how unresilient that progress really was. So for the first time in 25 years, extreme poverty is increasing. We're going into reverse in beating hunger. And it's not that we're necessarily immune in high income countries as well. Absolute poverty is set to rise in the UK, where I'm speaking to you in 2023. So something's going very wrong. Some of the clues about where that's going very wrong, I think, are really important for getting us to understand what we might do differently. So one of those clues you mentioned, Jennifer, is the absolute explosion in extreme wealth. We've been tracking this trend for a decade, and our most recent report found that since 2020, the richest 1% have captured almost 2/3 of all new wealth. As we're speaking, billionaire fortunes are increasing by 2.7 billion a day. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but this isn't a picture of just a sort of gross inequity. This isn't extreme poverty existing beside extreme wealth. This is extreme poverty existing because of extreme wealth, because of the way that the economic system functions and the shape of the economy and the shape of politics that it buys as well. I think the other clue that we need to look out for what's going wrong and what we need to unravel is the continued impact of colonialism and the long tail of sort of institutional racism in our global and national economies as well. And that explains many of the major fault lines in power and resource between countries and within societies as well. You know, we're talking while the G7 is happening, still the most elite grouping of power and economic decision making. And you see the faces of those people who club together in those powerful countries. It's very easy to see with whom power lies. Gender is another really major fault line that helps explain what's going wrong. And gender is weaponized and used as a tool within our economies to enforce economic disadvantage for women and girls. So I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about care. And care, rather than being at the forefront of what we value, is systematically undervalued. So unpaid care work, no country on earth do men do the same amount of unpaid care work than women. You see that translate into what parts of the economy are most accessible for women. So the informal economy, feminized sectors of the economy, such as the garment trade or domestic care industry, that take advantage of women's perceived natural abilities to pay them less and to value them less. And where women are in formal professional roles on a par with men, you're still seeing gender pay gaps persist. So what is it that we and final point I think we really need to make is the systematic undervaluing of the environment. You know, the extraction of the environment. It's seen as a resource or an input only in the service of growth, and we've created ecological destruction that is actually the greatest economic injustice of our time, because it's being caused by the richest and it's being disproportionately affected on the poorest. So just in my last couple of minutes, what might a different compassionate economics look like, and what would we need to value differently? We really need to move from this model of extraction to a model of regeneration. So I'm not just talking about resource extraction, I'm talking about the extraction of wealth. The economy is very good, you know, forget trickle down, the economy is very good at extracting wealth upwards globally and within countries. And the best tool we have to enforce that shift actually is democracy. We've really got to lean into not just government, but democracy as a space to regulate our economies and make them work for the many. We need to move, and I'm sure Stewart will talk more about this, but we really need to move from valuing growth to valuing well-being, the inadequacy of GDP and the importance of well-being. We need to think about care specifically. That should be our highest value in the economy, rather than, as it is at the moment, often completely undervalued and marginalized. And the other thing that I think we need to think about is a system and an economy that is imaginative and participatory. You know, we should value our roles as citizens, not consumers, in this political economy that we have. So increasing participation in design of solutions, experimenting with different business models that share value inherently, and with local placemaking as well. And then finally, just last point is that when we're talking about compassion, we have to remember that we need to go through a stage where we reckon with the ills of the past. This new economy has to be reparative and it has to be just. We can't just start with a blank slate. We're starting after hundreds of years of global economic interactions that are structurally racist, unjust to women and girls, and discriminatory to other identities and countries. So we need to start with a shared truth of that and a journey of recognition, apology, and reparative justice. So I will stop there, but I really look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. I'm actually going to move over. To Lene next, if you would like to come in. Then I'm going to go to Elham and I'm going to let Stewart finish up.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to squeeze 4 things into my 3 minutes. The first one is that when we talk about macroeconomics, we generally think of it as national macroeconomics. I studied business economy for 3 years, and I guess that everybody who's studied economy has learned about macroeconomics at the national level. We do not have a macro economic model or an understanding of what it means to be a globalized global economy, and we don't have a model for the digital economy either. So it's very much our frame of mind when we talk about economy at this structural level. How do we create a new one, or how do we create new values in the economy, so behind the machinery, so to speak. We even lack a model that can allow us to deal with a global digitized economy with digitized currencies and so forth. So we need to rethink what economy is at several levels. Then I would like to look at the economy as a game. And there is one economic game that everybody plays, and I guess nobody ever played it to the end, which is Monopoly. And why doesn't anybody ever play Monopoly to the end? It's because, you know, when 3 players are left, who's going to win the game anyway? And why would you waste the rest of a perfectly good evening on, you know, handing over all the expensive streets to your uncle who you hate anyway? So so Monopoly was created as a pedagogical tool to teach economics to ordinary people, and everybody, you know, knows how the game is going to end, and nobody applies that knowledge to the real economy. But what we're seeing is that the trickle up of the economy creates all these monopoly on the cash, and that's basically why we have all those enormously rich people and so many people who cannot make a living in the economy. So structurally, a free capitalist economy, which doesn't really exist anywhere, but in theory, a free economy is going to create a monopoly on all the cash. And I bet that with AI, very soon, an AI is going to figure out the market, buy up everything and own everything, and then poof, away went capitalism. But on the way to that point, we're going to see, even within the regulated economy that is the official economy and the official economies, more and more concentration of wealth. And one of the reasons is that we do not have a global model for the economy, because if we look at an economy of, say, 350 people, even if one person ends up with all the cash, that person can only become so rich because 350 people can only produce so much wealth. If we look at an economy of, say, 350,000 people, like Iceland, the richest person in Iceland, if they only have the Icelandic economy, can become very rich, but, you know, only as rich as 350,000 people can produce wealth. But then let's take the American economy, which is 350 million people, and the richest person there can be so much richer than within the Icelandic economy or the 350 people economy. And now we have this global economy where the richest people in the global economy are, of course, way richer than anything you can create the wealth you can create in many of the nation-state economies. So we have, for instance, the Walmart supermarket chain in the United States, which is, I think, family-owned. Their annual revenue is bigger than the GDP of Denmark. So if Denmark and Walmart went to war and we had to finance military, I don't know who would have the strongest forces, because there's more money being generated in Walmart than the GDP of Denmark. So we do not have an economic model for this. And with regards to compassion, how do we then create the next economy? And here I would like to go back to looking at games again, because one of the reasons people like playing games, computer games, online games, board games, is that the rules are the same for everybody. And you know what the reactions are going to be in the game, and everybody is going to have the same rewards and punishments if they play by the rules. And that's not how the economy works. So I think we should look at the economy as a game and say, what should be the rules that apply for everybody? How can you, if you fail in the game and die, so to speak, how can you re-enter the game and start all over again? How can you create the economic game so that it becomes worth playing, and so it can keep everybody active in the same economy? How should we change the rules of monopoly, for instance, so that once you reach a certain level of wealth, you start redistributing that money back out into the rest of the game so that everybody can keep playing the game? And I think by using that frame of mind, we can actually construct an economic model where people can keep working, keep making a living, where everybody feels that the economy is fair, just. There will never be complete equality. It wouldn't work. People are different, but the rules should be the same for everybody. And we can build into the structure of that economy compassion and justice, and that is a choice, and it's a choice that we have. So those would be my 4 things in 3 minutes.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I love the idea of rewriting the rules of Monopoly so that the game can go on. Elham, I'd like to come to you now.
Thank you so much. So just to say thank you to the organizers and everybody for being here today. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. So I think I'd like to focus on some concrete examples. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of there being a trade-off between compassion on the one hand and sound economic policy on the other, that somehow there's a choice between one or the other. And in this case, I'd like to just draw out some examples in the realm of asylum and refugee policy mainly, where actually the morally correct choice and the optimal one for the economy are the same, and there isn't that choice to be made. And in fact, it's the lack of compassion that has led to sort of poor policy outcomes driven by trends of xenophobia and distrust. So looking at the UK government's response to the refugee crisis, just as one of the examples, prior to 2021, the UK already had some policies in place to deter people from claiming asylum. These included restrictions on asylum seekers' right to work and restricted access to benefits. But since 2021, these policies have been even more harsh and restrictive, particularly towards making it easier to remove people to, quote, safe third countries without assessing their asylum claims at all, and giving fewer rights to refugees who cannot be removed and who remain in the UK. So in this context, the government has developed new policies around the first pillar of this, removing people to what are called safe third countries. And currently, the UK government has an agreement with only one third country that is willing to accept asylum seekers, and that's Rwanda. This agreement is not yet operational as of 2023, but it is in the works. The only reason it's not operational is because of legal challenges that were made to it. So if implemented, this would see some asylum seekers sent to Rwanda on a one-way flight to claim asylum there. Their entire file would be evaluated over in Rwanda. It's been criticized as a threat to the welfare of vulnerable people who arrive in the UK. It's been criticized by MPs from all parties, charities, human rights groups. And not only that, but it costs the taxpayer a tremendous amount of money. So far, the UK has paid the Rwandan government £114 million for the scheme, at a cost of about £13,000 per person to transfer each individual by charter flight. And even by the Home Office's own calculations, this doesn't save money in the short term, but it possibly saves money in the long term. And again, that's quite a dubious calculation with which I think there's not quite enough evidence. Partly the reason why the cost at the moment is so high of the UK's own asylum system at a cost of £1.5 billion a year is because of the processing time it takes to process applicants, and also because asylum seekers are not allowed to work while waiting for confirmation of status, which makes the system even more expensive. A quick evaluation by the Oxford Migration Institute predicts that this will have, despite being quite costly, will have very little impact as a deterrent. It's conflicts themselves, the prevalence of conflict that drives people to seek asylum rather than the policy on the receiving end. Often there's a lot of misinformation or just a lack of awareness about what's happening on the receiving end. And, you know, to look briefly at the effectiveness of this, I mean, this is being proposed at a time when Britain is facing severe labor shortages as a result of Brexit. So at the moment, there's a shortfall of 330,000 workers in the UK due to Brexit. This was coming out of The Guardian just a few weeks ago, mostly in the low-skilled economy. So for there to be, on the one hand, a labor shortage that's quite severe and damaging to the economy, and on the other hand, such a concerted drive to push away asylum seekers who could very easily be placed in these positions and in these roles, is entirely counterproductive. It's a system that is not only lacking in compassion, but is also irrational from the policy side of things. And I don't want to single out the UK too much. Florida is pursuing a similar policy when it comes to undocumented immigrants, leading to shortages as well in farms and farming, where those were the people taking up the majority of roles, and in the construction sector. Bigger issues around this. Western countries are also cutting back their aid budgets with this idea that, you know, we haven't got money to spare. Countries like Sweden, Norway, and the UK have all cut their aid budgets. And these are budgets that are needed not only as kind of this idea of charity, but that money goes towards stabilizing countries that often act as first responders to the refugee crises. So the majority of refugees are taken up, are housed and sheltered by neighboring states. East Africa houses or hosts 5 million refugees at the moment. In Lebanon, 1 out of every 5 is a Syrian refugee. So cutting back budgets over here is also not economically sound if we want to think in totality about the refugee problem. So I just wanted to provide these examples of situations where you know, the compassionate choice is the viable choice economically. And you know, I think there's other things to be said about other countries in the global system. The 6 Gulf countries that I work on, mostly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the concept of a refugee isn't recognized in law. So if you are entering the country, you cannot do so as a refugee. You would come in as a migrant worker, right? And I think there's all sorts of drawbacks to that. There's also a need for other countries in the global system to catch up, where there is capacity to be taking up these obligations and a duty to do so. So yeah, just wanted to provide some concrete examples for us to think about.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I'm really struck by the perversity that it isn't, in fact, best economics that drive political decisions. It's perverse. Stewart, over to you.
Well, thanks all of you, and it's great to be with you. I think the way I characterize the current economic system is by 4 U's. It's unsustainable, it's unfair, it's unstable, and making far too many people unhappy, or in other words, causing massive suffering to many. And, you know, very much echoing what Lene is saying, I also think it's morally and intellectually bankrupt. So I'd be as damning as that. But there is some good news. I think just to say the way that the current system's kept in place is a combination of the power, which Katy's been talking about, of relatively small groups in society, and a whole series of myths and half-truths. We still have this idea knocking around that if only we just look after ourselves and selfishly pursue our own ends, then it's for the common good. And that's never been true, but it's even less true now where we've moved from being a small world on a big planet to being a big world on a small planet and coming up against limits of all types. So we're in a fundamentally different place, but some good news. And I'm going to say a bit more about how we shift systems. The good news is that in the wealthier democracies in the 20th century, they changed the economic system twice, to Keynesianism mid-century, and then to so-called neoliberalism late century. And when you look at shifts like that, and whether you're looking at economic shifts or even the abolition of slavery or the civil rights movement, we tend to think we just need to talk about what's needed. And that actually isn't how systems change. We can write all the reports we want, we can go to the conference we want, we can say, right, endlessly. Systems change when new power is created that forces a vanguard power base that forces change. And secondly, when we start telling ourselves new stories about who we are as humans and what we value and how we want to live together, because we're a storytelling species. And that's what we've got to do now. The new power we have to talk about here is going to require what I call radical collaboration. It's going to require all those who know things are wrong and want to do something about it, working together across levels. It's not just bottom up, or it's not just top down, it's both. It's across sectors and it's across geographies. And it requires all sorts of organizations that have failed to collaborate up to now to work together. We can't do like the neoliberals did because they were funded by billions and it was a top-down elite strategy. We need a strategy that involves millions or thousands and millions of hearts, hands and heads. And that's what we need. And we've been surprised. We set up the Wellbeing Economy Alliance just under 5 years ago to help catalyze such radical collaboration. And we've been surprised in that time by just how many people are willing to do it. Already, 400 global organizations have joined, thousands of individuals have come together, and 6 governments have committed to becoming a wellbeing economy. And a wellbeing economy, we haven't got time to go into now, but basically operates a totally different set of values, institutions, and goals. And you aim at what you want to achieve. And we know we can write down endlessly what many people, it's written across many faiths, it's written across, go to indigenous groups, you come up with the same things that people want. Basically, the needs of the many being met before the wants of a few. Much fairer, I think, Scandinavia. People having a say, participation, as Katy was talking about, in their economy, a sense of control. Institutions serving the common good. By the common good, I believe we have to talk about not just the common good of humanity, but the common good of all life. And I think that's critical that we start talking in that way. And fundamentally, that we have to have a different view of living within the natural world, in unity with the natural world, and move from an anthropocentric to an ecological view of who we are and how we live together and live within planetary limits. Now, those can sound hard, but it's been fascinating. Those governments have shifted already to being a wellbeing economy. You can see they handled the pandemic much better because they were talking in pre-distribution terms before. They were talking about prevention before. So we can actually do it. Oddly, the world seems in such a mess, but I actually feel more optimistic than I have in my quite long life, and working now, that we actually can shift this thing. But it requires radical collaboration and it requires new stories that talk the truth about who we are as humans. That's for me for the minute.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stewart. Thank you so much, all of you. And I wanted to pick up on something you said about creating or finding the new power. How can we, those of us on this call, take part in that process?
The way I would say is one of the things we're doing also in Wellbeing Economy Alliance is creating local hubs. And it's still relatively early. We've got about 20 around the world. So if you happen to be in a country where there's a Wellbeing Economy hub, join it. But you're also welcome, any individual, to join the Wellbeing Economy as an individual member. And you can then go online and link with people right across the world. So that's one way. But also link, we know there are many organizations, Oxfam, many different organizations in the development space, in the climate change space, in the social justice space, in the feminist spaces. Join those. So we're just one group trying to bring people together, but we need that radical collaboration of different groups that are fighting. It's no good talking now about a separate social justice movement from a climate change movement or from a feminist movement. These things are interlinked fundamentally, and it will only be by working together and showing how these all fit together that we will bring the changes we want. Because we have to talk, we have to create power, and we have to create a vision that really feels hopeful to enough people that have to change. Because I used to bash my head against various walls and the New Economics Foundation, talking to government officials, great discussions, but they would say, I can't do it because I haven't got the mandate for change. It will only come where enough organizations are coming together. So interestingly, just to take an example of a hub, the We All Hub in Scotland has now people from the university, the Church of Scotland, politicians, investment houses, footballers, community groups, ecologists. We need that sort of gathering of people to put pressure on governments for change. And so join any of those groups, join We All, and let's all find a way of creating a much more compassionate economy together, because it's possible. We have to do a bigger change in the 20th century, but we can do it.
Thank you, Stewart. And Katy, just to pick up on what you said about gender and the failure of our current economic system to really recognise the economic input of women or put an economic value on the input of caring. And I'm thinking of the women's strike in Iceland. And when Stewart talks about new power, I'm wondering what opportunities there are for women to organise on a global level to try and make an intervention about that absence of proper value being attached to their work.
Yes, I mean, it's been the ongoing structural problem, hasn't it? Which is that if you withdraw your labour from your loved ones, your patients, your family members, that's a very difficult thing to do, and so there have been some really inspiring examples. I think that took a lot of organising of who was actually going to do the work, before the strike kicked off. So some of the things that I think we need to do on that is, firstly, we need to start to unite what the late David Graeber talked about, the caring classes. We need to stop talking about these as individual problems: adult social care, childcare, nurses' strikes. I realise I'm taking some very UK-centric examples, but I think that domestic workers' rights in developing countries, there are many united voices, and they're not just women. This is because this is the future of the economy. Lene talked about AI. We need to lean into our humanity for where jobs and for where economic activity is going to be. So I think that's one of the first things. We need to create a sort of greater solidarity amongst caring classes and green classes, as well, as we think about a sort of just transition economy. But we, as Stewart says, exactly, that's the kind of power angle of systems change, united power. We need to invest in women's rights groups and in domestic workers groups, but we need to change stories and narratives as well. And I think one of the dangers when we talk about this issue is, you know, we talk about women leaning into the workplace and women's participation in the economy. We're not asking women to not be caring. Everybody should be caring, your whole organization. Compassion is that, but compassion and care should not systematically disadvantage you in the economy. That's the point. It shouldn't be weaponized to pay people less and to value them less. So we really need to change our narratives. That involves changing what we measure. GDP, obviously, you know, famously, I look after my own children and that doesn't count to GDP, but I pay the nursery an arm and a leg and that does. So we have some inconsistencies there. And then the kind of shifts that help change as well. And I think AI, with all its you know, horrifying threats, may be part of those deeper questions about what the future world of work looks like and how we value it.
Thank you. And Lene, you talked about that need for fairness, the fairness of the rules. Where does this start? Can national governments alone do it? Does it have to be global agreement? How do we start to change the rules so that they are fairer?
I would say, also repeating what Katy said, I mean, we get what we measure. So if we measure GDP, we're going to have more economic growth in one kind of definition of what is economic growth. If we measured, so I'm very afraid of starting to measure well-being as an emotion or as a subjective experience of well-being. But I would love to measure transactions or interactions, because they're more measurable and objective. And we could do that with some of the care services, whether they're provided in the home or within a paid-for system, whether it's private or public. So, I mean, we could have random 10,000 people telling how many interactions they've had with people in a care situation, and then we could measure how much of that is taking place not in the economy, but in society. And maybe we should talk about society more than the economy, because the economy should be a tool for society and not a goal in itself. So, of course, we need to have a thriving economy. We need to have an economy that doesn't crash. We need to have a complex economy. And when we talk about capitalism, it's one part of the market economy. And it's the part of the market economy where you start with capital, you invest it in something to produce something, not to produce it, but to make more capital, more money. In the market economy, you start with a product, then you take it to market to get some money so you can buy some more stuff. And so the market economy is a good place. The capitalism is part of the market economy. Within the market economy, we can have cooperatives. So people can self-organize and co-own the local production. You can also have steward ownership, which we actually do have a lot of in Denmark. Some of the biggest companies in Denmark are steward owned, which means that there's a set of bylaws defining what the profit can be used for, which means that it's a capitalist company it's working in the capitalist economy, but the point is not to create more money for the owners. The point is to create value for either society or a certain group of people or a project or the arts or something like that. So we can actually construct different entities in the economy that work within the known economy, but based on completely different ideas. And people can still have jobs, be productive, start their own businesses, and have that sense of economic freedom that comes from, hey, I got an idea, I would like to try it. How do I, get some cash to start, and how do I, be the master of my own castle, whatever you want to call it, my own life. So room for initiative and agency, and still a lot of way of organizing it.
Thank you. And Elham, there seems to be a kind of hierarchy of economic arguments, doesn't there? Because you've made a very powerful argument for the economic benefit of allowing migration, and yet that argument isn't listened to. So is there something that drives economic decision making that is beyond the P&L, beyond the real economics?
Absolutely. I think, it's also just about access to information. This information is out there. I was able to research this and, find out the data and the figures and all this, but so much of this is dependent on having a free press and a free media. And if that's not available in the mainstream, then it should be made available in alternatives. And we're at a time and place where it is being made available. And I think that's why I do share some of Stewart's optimism about the future moving forward. People are gaining access to these platforms where information is presented in a compassionate way and in a way that's fair and balanced, which isn't always there in the mainstream. So I'm optimistic about that. Also, what Stewart mentioned about grassroots movements and civic movements and people coming together to just talk and build movements up as communities and as people. I think these are all kind of the anecdotes to the sort of terrible trends that we're seeing in the world today. And more democracy, of course, at the grassroots level too. I think is really the way to counteract these narratives. Yeah.
And Stewart, you mentioned, that we'd had two economic orthodoxies within the last 100 years, Keynesianism and then neoliberalism, Friedmanism. And of course, Friedman only started in the early 60s. So in fact, it's a relatively short period of time where the world of economics and business has been driven purely by generating maximum wealth with as few restrictions on where that wealth flows. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the purpose of the economy, because if we take that part of the problem is that our economy is being used for the wrong purpose, I'd love to hear from you all about how we could repurpose the economy and what we should be asking the economy to deliver. Yeah,
I mean, Lena's said some of it already, and I think Katy has as well. We obviously have to start from measuring something differently. And I'd agree with you, Lene, don't measure well-being directly. You measure what you set your economy out to do, though, is what do you actually want for your people? And it'll be different in different places. But for instance, New Zealand now has done well-being economy budgeting, where they've looked at a whole range of things that they want to do in the economy, and Iceland very similarly. And you're setting out, for instance, that you want to tackle poverty, you want to live within decarbonize your economy, you want to get a just transition, you want the situation of women and indigenous people to be better. So you set out a range of goals like that, and you aim directly at them. At the minute, we have this stupid system of aiming at GDP growth, hoping that it will do everything for everybody, and then spending a huge amount of money, something we call failure demand. In many economies, you're spending 10 or 20% of that GDP, just trying and failing usually to sort out the problems you caused in the first place by growing the wrong things for the wrong people. So you have to actually say, what do we want to achieve in terms of equity? What do we want to achieve in terms of meeting, so enough people have sufficient to meet their needs and to be able to flourish, not just to live, that you get much fairer, that you get that you start regenerating your environment rather than just sustaining it. Sustainability is old, the wrong term. We've got to talk about regeneration. And so you set out actively to do the things you want, and you grow. That growth then becomes a means to an end rather than the end in itself. I mean, if you think about it for a second, GDP is just a speedometer. It tells you you're going faster or slower, but going fast in the wrong direction is a pretty stupid thing to do. And that's what we're doing a lot of the time. We're growing the wrong things for the wrong people. And you need to just see growth as a means. And I very much agree with Lene as well about the purpose of your, you want all your institutions, your businesses, to have a social purpose that you agree in society. It will be different in different places. And I think we muddle up capitalism and market systems. And a market system, provided it's managed for the common good, is generally a good thing. Amartya Sen, philosopher, said, you know, to be against markets is like being against conversation. They're everywhere. But the problem is, people muddle that up with capitalism, and capitalism in the strict Marxian sense is about the main power and wealth accruing to the people who've already got it. And that's the problem, that it's outdated, it's served its purpose. We need to move on from and to much more a system where you still have a mixture of private, public, and third sector actors working in the market economy, but operating to a very different set of goals, where you're directly saying what you want to achieve, and a very different set of values, which are very much fit with what with a compassionate view of what we're trying to do in the world. And that's what people want. I think you can talk to people almost anywhere in the world and they'll say this is what they want. So we just have to make it happen. And it's actually be much more efficient. We're just wasting so much resource now, let alone causing so many problems. And it's doable. So back to what Elham was saying, we're actually being very stupid. We're going faster and faster, burning up the planet, causing a lot of distress to a lot of people, and not even making ourselves any happier, which is pretty stupid. Whereas we can actually address all those problems directly.
And Stewart, you mentioned the G word, growth, there. And of course, this is yet another pole developing growth. You're either for growth or anti-growth. How can we reframe the talk of growth? Because obviously, and this is a question for the whole panel, politicians want to sell the idea of prosperity, better times coming, and that's predicated in the current economic system on growth, but then growth, of course, is not sustainable ecologically. So what is the narrative? What is the story we need to be adopting there?
Yeah, well, I'll just say very quickly, but I'd love to hear the others. I think it's starting to be agnostic about growth. As I say, it's just one tool amongst several. And the issue is what's growing for whom? Because you take a lot of people in the world, they actually need some growth in their wealth. So it's about what you need to grow and for whom. Whereas there's other people, if I one of the Schumacher, who's an economist, I looked, said, if my child grows, that's brilliant. If I grow, when I'm middle-aged, it's in all the wrong places, and it's not a good idea. And so you cannot just talk about growth in an unnuanced way. You've got to, and yes, we do have to. Again, we're up against ecological limits or resource limits. There are not enough resources in the world, and even moving to electric cars and electrification, we're going to come up against all sorts of mineral resources and real problems there. So we have to, there are some things we will have to limit, but again, you have to, in effect, ration what goes into the market and then find a way of distributing that fairly. So we have to have a nuanced view of this. So for some people, things need to grow, for some people, they don't.
Thank you. And actually, I've just seen the time, so we need to jump into some of the fantastic questions that people have been posting in the chat. So, Katy, I don't know if you want to take this one from Samjeeb Mukherjee in Calcutta. Can any part of nature be privately owned? They've asked a few questions, but let's pick on that one, private ownership of nature.
Great, thank you. I was just reading it. Hi to you, Sanjeeb, and hello to Calcutta, my favourite city in India. So first of all, I think it's a question of what we mean by ownership. And this goes back to some of the narrative points that we've made as well. An awful lot of our conception of ownership really comes back down to our ability to sort of use, extract, sell, and make use of things, and that's what counts as ownership. But what about stewardship? What about care? What about looking after and also your duty to pass on to future generations? One of the innovations in the world that Stewart works in is countries such as Wales that now has a Future Generations Commissioner to think about the things that we hold in trust. Having said that, I do think there are some limits to things that should be privately owned, particularly where we're talking about the types of private sector that Stewart and Lene were differentiating apart. Coming back to another narrative point, I think it's absolutely vital to reject the idea of the private sector as a monolith. It is often used against campaigners to say, oh, you're anti-private sector. Well, private sector ranges from everything to Walmart, as we mentioned, through to your local cooperative, through to, as you say, just basic market interactions between people. We've got to reject that. The private sector, its shape, its ownership models, what it's there to see as its purpose, can be a really fantastic part of the economy we're talking about, and it can own things. But where we're talking about private ownership of intellectual property rights on COVID vaccines, for instance, when we're talking about private ownership of common resources, oceans, etc., then I think without really strong models of care and without really strong regulation, it does look like that's part of an old paradigm economy we need to leave behind.
Thank you. And we've got another question from Praveen Sinha, also in India. They say agricultural revolution to industrial revolution, it increased the divide between rich and poor. So where was the place of compassionate economics in this transformation? They may have answered their own question, I think.
I would like to say something about growth and capitalism, because I mean it's a very privileged position to say that we don't need growth when you're in the western part of the globe, because we had our growth and live very comfortable lives, a lot of us, not everybody, but many of us, and huge parts of the world need more growth, so we need to figure out how to do that. And that's one of the things I mean by saying we need a macroeconomic model, because how do we deal with a globe where some parts of the globe had all the growth that we can eat and consume, and more than that, whereas the rest of the globe doesn't. And we can't just ship stuff to the poor part of the globe or send money. There has to be local growth and development so that it's local sustainable economies, not just sustainable with regards to nature, but also with regards to the economy. And we do not have a model for that, to sort of switch from, so when have we had enough capitalism and need to go to the next kind of economy? And when do you sort of start the capitalist era so that you can have economic growth and have local, I mean, the advantage of capitalism is that it produces the extra cash that allows you to have research and development, science. Somebody has to pay for all the stuff that doesn't create, a sellable product right away. So we need to see this as many different interacting kinds of economies and systems, and we do not have a model for that yet.
Excellent point, thank you. And then we have a question from Perrin. 2 of the recent expected outcomes from corporations in the recently published Code of Governance in Lesotho are intergenerational value and peace. Is this something we should see from other codes and measures of governance from around the world? Intergenerational value and peace. Who would like to comment on that? I know that the Wellbeing model is very much predicated on the welfare of the next generation.
Yes, and Katy's already mentioned, haven't you, Katy, that the Wales has a Future of Next Generation Act, and that's exactly right. That absolutely those 2 values of intergenerational equity and peace are right. And as many of you know, when you look at indigenous cultures, people think quite often 7 generations ahead. So it's that type of story that we have to be telling ourselves, both our unity of humans and nature, and that all the time we're not just thinking about fairness and justice currently, but fairness and justice for the future. And I think, I think those are absolutely correct. And I just want to pick up one thing Lene is saying, because I think the type of economy we're talking about, which is still a mixture of private, public, and third sector, but operating to a very different set of values and goals, will still be creating value. But it'd be creating value for common good, which can be reinvested. So I don't think it's unique to capitalism in the strict Marxian sense that you don't create value. You do create value in a different type of economy that might have a whole range of different ownership models. And I agree with Katy as well that the private sector and even strict capitalism, it works very well at the level of people setting up competing restaurants that are either good or not, and some of them survive. There's a value to that at that scale, but we've tended to take one model and think it works at massive scale, and it doesn't. It works very well at certain scales and the village level market or whatever. It doesn't work when the power gets into their hands and it's working at a massive scale where it's dealing with many issues. So we keep creating these simple answers, capitalism versus communism, that it's not as simple as that. But as we come back to the values that are absolutely embodied in compassion and compassion economics, we start to have some of the answers of what needs to be designed by people in their own places. And it's going to look different in different places, but it would be the same set of goals that you're aiming at.
Thank you, Stewart. And I'll just give the other three panelists a moment just for a closing thought. If you want to wave a magic wand or whatever you want to do with your last minute. Elham, what are you?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in. I think I'll just jump in on the last question that was asked on the code of conduct of corporations. Part of the issue really is the lack of regulation in the international system for international corporations. There's just such a lack of mechanisms to bring them to account. And even within states, those mechanisms are weak. So in the UK, the Modern Slavery Act was introduced as an attempt to kind of solve some part of this. But what it essentially does is require corporations to report on what they're doing to end modern slavery in their supply chain. But that's sort of it. It doesn't actually require them to take additional steps beyond the reporting requirement. And that's the case across the globe in the US as well, alien tort claim. I mean, there's just really very weak mechanisms for corporate accountability. So there is a role to be played to strengthen these things, even as just the first step before we talk about reshaping anything. And that would be my kind of concluding thought. I'm happy to be part of this discussion. I think we need so much more of this, just these spaces where people from around the globe can come together and share knowledge and share ideas and build coalitions and build momentum. We need more of this, and happy to be part of it.
Thank you so much. And Katy and Lene, you each got 30 seconds.
Yeah. I'll just say thank you for inviting me and pass on the floor to Katy.
Yeah, similarly, thank you for inviting me. And thanks not for making this some kind of faux debate. We really need to get beyond the past of sort of intellectual sparring. We need collaboration and ideas coming together, because the system we're living in, it really isn't working for anybody. So thank you for that. And this was great.
Thank you all so much. And we will be holding further conversations, and part of the work of the Global Compassion Coalition is to bring people. And I was very struck by what Stewart said about bringing together people from different sectors, or maybe it was Katy, I can't remember who said it, but really creating a new global movement that is towards repurposing our economy for the good of all. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your wisdom. Thank you for joining us from all over the globe. And I look forward to being back with you all soon.